Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
There was yet another meme that crossed my path today. It's a brief conversation between a sort of Giga Chad with a monocle and a pipe and a soy-facing Wojak. So this is probably now becoming impenetrable already to a lot of people, but I think it'll come out in the wash. So the Giga Chad, this muscular gentleman in the suit says, "I don't ever want to work. The idea of wasting my life at 9 to 5 every week just so I can survive is awful. I want to spend all day with the arts, with my subsistence taken care of." And then the bald guy with the glasses and the beard who spends all his time on the internet goes, "Wow, a fellow communist." And then back to the guy in the suit. He says, "Actually, I'm an aristocrat and you will be my slave." So what's the joke here? The joke here is that we live in a society where, the capitalist work ethic is increasingly frowned upon by both ends of the horseshoe. And we live in a society where the thing that kept that going was like democratic patriarchy, where the man was the head of the household and he worked 9 to 5 at a job that didn't fulfill all of his dreams and fantasies about self-actualization. He did the hard work and he came home and he brought home the bacon, he fed his family. And what made the economy go and what made America a productive place where a middle class existed and there was broad-based prosperity was that the guys were stuck with this role and they stoically accepted the role and they received a certain measure of social and cultural and family power and authority.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and weird editor of the American Mind. Seth Barron, our managing editor, is out. Thank you, sir. Seth Barron's out this week, so I am joined this week by publisher and President Ryan Williams, and back on his triumphant return to much accolade and congratulations, James Poulos, editor of the American Mind and newly married, happy husband, back from his honeymoon. James, congratulations on behalf of the entire listenership. Welcome back.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be back with you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, you didn't miss much. We thought we would spend the first segment catching you up on everything that happened while you were away, but really it was mostly just chats about summer blockbusters and the latest stock trends.
I was told that nothing ever happens. So as a precaution, I thought I'd make lots of good friends with the cartels to the south of the border, so that if I needed to return at the head of a caravan of Knights Templar with AKs and Toyota Hiluxes, I could do so.
Smart. Very, very smart. All right. Nice to know we're in good hands. In that case, we'll just leap right in to the present day, up to the minute. Last week, it fell to me to give a brief précis of the brat phenomenon. Now, I once again don my hat as special needs editor of the American Mind to explicate the weird phenomenon. Brat was the attempted rebranding of Kamala as the sassy youth candidate. Weird is the attempted rebranding of J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and the Republicans more generally as the out-of-touch bizarro ticket. Great little piece by Byron York in the Washington Examiner TikToks the emergence of this talking point, which, like many such talking points, seems to have gone out over the transom, over the wire that feeds directly into the upper spine and brain stems of all MSNBC contributors and Democrat operatives. But I repeat myself, York points out that this whole shtick seems to have originated with Governor Tim Walz, Democrat of Minnesota, who not coincidentally seems to be on the short list for Kamala's VP pick. Walz, in an MSNBC interview, put out this idea that Trump and Vance are these fringe extremist weirdos that are way too online and need to touch grass. Then the Kamala campaign, always quick to grab an ounce of relevance and charm from wherever it can find it, lying on the ground, sent out a press release, headline, J.D. Vance is a creep who wants to ban abortion nationwide. First sentence of this release read, J.D. Vance is weird. York goes on. By the weekend shows on MSNBC and CNN were talking about it, giving Waltz credit. The head of the Democratic National Committee predicted victory in November, in part because its Republican opponents are weirdos. Later, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, whom we know from the COVID days, pulled herself out of the vice presidential pool, claimed the weird talking point was breaking through because of the Republican agenda and the way they address people. It's bizarre. It's weird. It is weird. And weird is a kind of a funny phrase to use because it's bizarre. That sounds like a robot programmed with ChatGPT trying to explain why the kids are talking the way they're talking these days. But I am one of these weird, out of touch Republicans. So you guys have to tell me, what's the idea here? Was this a sort of effort to, well, I know it was an effort to marginalize the Republicans. Was it because they had nothing else? Was it because they think this is an effective winning strategy? Was it simply, did it emerge organically out of TikTok and then get absorbed into the Democrat rhetorical strategy? What do you think about this? And will it endure? Will it work?
So a couple things. I've tried, in spite of myself and against my better judgment, over years now to go back and find what in my mind. I don't think this is like a Mandela effect thing. In my mind, Will Wilkinson, when he was a columnist for the New York Times, did write a column called "We Are the Real Americans," and it was about how cosmopolitan, big city dwelling Americans were, in fact, the real Americans, the beating heart of the United States of America current year, and that all those hicks who lived in the sticks were, in fact, not really the real Americans. They were now this sort of like vestigial organ, and perhaps we didn't need to have an appendectomy, but certainly we didn't need to let these people sort of like insist that they were real America and they deserved to like run the country, and if anyone had a problem with that, then they were a freak. I can't find that column. I don't know if it was scrubbed. I don't know if it was a fever dream. It was a convincing one. If so,
I can validate, James, that I have a vague notion that I saw that at some point.
Okay,
so that's completely ironclad scientific validation that it in fact occurred.
A sample of 100% results. So I think for some time there's been this idea, this sensation bubbling up, that we need to readjust our priors about what normalcy is, and normalizing this, normalizing that. At a certain point, that project succeeds to a degree where you say like, hey, weird is the new normal. And I think that we've seen that start to take hold in this, whatever this is, Kamala campaign. And I think it's not going to stop anytime soon, and is probably only going to spread. That said, I noticed over the past really just 24 to 48 hours that the blowback from J.D. Vance defenders has taken not just the turn of like, hey, he's not weird, he's normal, he's the boy next door, he's like, sort of Appalachian like marriage material. There's another kind of blowback, and this is mostly anons, but not entirely anons, I don't think, who are saying, sort of jumping off from that attempted Atlantic hit on JD as a weird guy, using that political cartoon of him looking like a wizard out of Tolkien, like puffing on this weird pipe and blowing weird smoke rings. They're saying, no, in fact, J.D. Vance is weird, but WYRD, which is the original Old English 1400s meaning origin of weird, which is like someone who has the ability to decide your fate or destiny, or in fact is what is to come or what is to pass. That was of note to me because, in fact, I'm just going to pull it up here. You will have to indulge me. On March 11, 2021, I tweeted, back when it was a tweet, that TV's modern and pomo weird is obsolete. Digital retrieves the weird of the Middle Ages. And sure enough, screen capped etimonline.com, one of my favorite websites, Yes, the origin of the word weird, you go back to circa 1400, having power to control fate, from the Old English WYRD, weird. Fate, chance, fortune, destiny, literally that which comes. I am going to take a small victory lap here since I haven't imposed myself on anyone for the past few weeks. I saw it all coming 3 years ago, and it's getting tough to remain 3 years out ahead of the crowd these days. I feel lucky to be 3 days ahead of events. But yeah, not surprising, not that weird.
Yeah, it's been clear for a while, I think, that this effort to redefine what counts as normal almost is the central dispute of American politics or realignment or whatever. And I thought of the like Edmund Smirk signal going up when this started to become a trend, because Smirk is this online dude who talks about the normal Americans, that he calls it Taylor Swift normality. That is just people kind of vague patriotism and looseness around, or actually enthusiastic patriotism, but vague looseness around social issues, who go to Taylor Swift concerts and don't freak out. In contrast to the freak right, as he calls it, which is this very online, perhaps represented by the DeSantis campaign, and in fact, sort of out of touch, hyper theoretical and in the weeds kind of digital right. That is the portrait, I think, that is supposed to be behind this whole effort to brand the Republican Party generally as weird, an appreciation for Lord of the Rings as sort of nerdy or out of left field. There have been some weird references to Lord of the Rings as if it's something that needs introduction and explaining to kind of lump it in among those kids that you didn't want to sit with in class. It's been pointed out that this is a very like Mean Girls way of doing politics. It's like, ew, you're being a little bit weird, a sort of form of ostracization. It's also been pointed out, of course, that this is coming from the people who themselves have spent the last, I don't know, decades indulging in the most arcane, abstruse theories about what should count as normal and what should count as weird, defining basically Americanism as bizarre and heartily endorsing the mantle of out there, let your freak flag fly, be as wild and crazy as you naturally want to be, you special flower, you. So this is a hard pivot, but it's also kind of baked into the fight, the cultural fight that is going on and has been for a while, because at some deep level, I think it's about like what norms and attitudes we want to really embody as a country. And I think like the Dems know that in reality land, they are by and large like way on the outs of that normal universe for Americans. It's just that being in control of many media organs, they're able to confect at least a world where weird is normal and normal is weird. So who knows? We'll have to see if it works.
Yeah, it's of a piece, I think, with the it's sort of a mix, right? It's the tendency on the left in recent decades, and especially probably the last two, has been to pathologize their political opponents. Certain areas of identity are not realms of disputation about policy and incentives and all the rest. You are either, to take immigration, you are either pro whatever the progressive left wants on immigration, or you are a xenophobe. So we've transported all these terms from psychology into the discourse. So you're not arguing in good faith about the effects of talking anew about and trying to change sexual mores, whether it be on issues of gay marriage or transgenderism or anything else. You are a transphobe, you are a homophobe, etc. You are somehow sick. And I think this is just the soft version of that. You're weird. They're weird, You don't have to actually make any arguments. And it's also a piece of the age-old ad hominem attack. You don't have to attack the ideas. You just have to attack the person. Now, to be fair, the Democrats try to link the ideas with the weirdness. So we'll give them that, at least, if we We have to be honest about what our opponents are up to. And then finally, it is of a piece with progressivism's drive and philosophy and mode of political discourse for a century now, which is, I think it's kind of a stand-in for what it's like, a flippant kind of ha-ha digital memeable version of what liberalism thinks about conservatism, and what progressivism has thought about. Conservatism's too narrow for what progressivism has fought against for the last 100 years, but has thought about constitutionalism or the principles of the founding, natural right. Take your pick. These days, it's progressivism or liberalism versus conservatism, which is to say, if you don't hold this, if your opinions are somehow outside, or your opinions or your policy positions are somehow outside this basket of things we consider legitimate and the latest and greatest evolution of truth and justice and beauty, then we don't have to argue with you about it. We just have to cast you out of respectable company. And this is, again, just a soft version of it. I don't know about their ideas, but they're just weird. And I will just quote, at the risk of courting controversy, there's an added aspect to it too, which our former fellow, that is a Publius alum and great editor and frequent CRB contributor, Helen Andrews, tweeted yesterday, or 2 days ago, calling people weird is such feminine behavior. Textbook sex difference. Men engage in open conflict. Women police conformity. It's honestly disorienting to hear male politicians use the line. So, in irony of ironies, if we accept Helen's take on it, which I think there's a lot to it, irony of ironies, in calling J.D. Vance weird, they sort of validate maybe his weird comments, according to the left, about cat ladies, et cetera. The feminization of our politics, and in some ways, feminization of the Democratic Party. And all I mean by that is just to say the priorities and affectations and modes of argumentation are more feminine than masculine. And all I mean by that is the sort of traditional, take your big five personality traits and map them onto the two genders. And the Democratic Party seems to be more feminine in that sense. So there's a lot to chew on there. It's interesting. And I'll just raise Byron York's point, and just to put an emphasis on it, which is the conduct of the Democratic Party over the last 4 weeks, in the technical sense of the term, has been weird as a matter of Democratic politics. So, they elevate a vice presidential candidate who was never popular, dropped out of the race before any primaries were held, never got a single delegate, and they somehow advance her as the latest, greatest, and best hope for democracy. They shove aside their aging president, which from all accounts, they sort of extorted him or strong-armed him by threatening him with the 25th Amendment and removal. And yet they allow him to stay in office through, January 20th. So I don't know if that's weird. It's sort of schizophrenic. It's shameless at the very least. And I think, I don't know, Byron wonders whether this whole, he cites, as I think Spencer at least alluded to, Byron sorts the maybe the diminishing returns on this Democratic tendency to call people weird by showing all the right-wing Twitter folks were posting, weird, textbook weird conduct by the Democratic Party, with the J.D. Vance is weird said ironically in quotes beside it. So maybe it's all run its course, but I'm with you, Spencer. It's I don't know what to make of it. It's none of it's good. And it seems like a very odd way to conduct oneself in a self-governing republic or a representative democracy. Now, I realize we've been somewhat degraded from the beau ideal of a representative democracy over recent decades, but still, it's yet one example amongst 800 over the last 8 years that should give every intelligent and thoughtful and patriotic citizen great pause at the trajectory of our politics. So it's not good.
I just, I want to belabor this a little bit more because I think it really opens up onto some grand vistas that are worth contemplating, or at least gazing out on for as long as you can stand it. I'm put in mind of Weird Al's song "Dare to Be Stupid." This seems to belong in this conversation as well, which is also sort of resonant of the bell curve meme, which has the drooling imbecile at one end and the cosmic mind hooded genius at the other, saying the same thing, which is like extremely, let's say, underthought, and this is like wisdom. And then in the middle of the bell curve is the dreaded midwit, who is the low status, bog standard person no one wants to be, who's like trying to be intelligent and providing like a long-winded analysis of something, typically accompanied by some kind of anxiety. Whereas the drooling imbecile and the super genius have no anxiety and aren't overthinking anything and just kind of running on instinct at the point where instinct and cosmic wisdom converge. There was yet another meme that crossed my path today. It's a brief conversation between a sort of Giga Chad with a monocle and a pipe and a soy-facing Wojak. So this is probably now becoming impenetrable already to a lot of people, but I think it'll come out in the wash. So the Giga Chad, this muscular gentleman in the suit says, "I don't ever want to work. The idea of wasting my life at 9 to 5 every week just so I can survive is awful. I want to spend all day with the arts, with my subsistence taken care of." And then the bald guy with the glasses and the beard who spends all his time on the internet goes, "Wow, a fellow communist." And then back to the guy in the suit. He says, "Actually, I'm an aristocrat and you will be my slave." So what's the joke here? The joke here is that we live in a society where, the capitalist work ethic is increasingly frowned upon by both ends of the horseshoe. And we live in a society where the thing that kept that going was like democratic patriarchy, where the man was the head of the household and he worked 9 to 5 at a job that didn't fulfill all of his dreams and fantasies about self-actualization. He did the hard work and he came home and he brought home the bacon, he fed his family, and what made the economy go and what made America a productive place where a middle class existed and there was broad-based prosperity was that the guys were stuck with this role and they stoically accepted the role and they received a certain measure of social and cultural and family power and authority. And when you break the back of that social structure, there are consequences. And one of those consequences that we're seeing today is you put women into the workforce. Predominantly, the roles that are created in the corporate workforce for women are unlike the kinds of laborious roles that men of the, right up until the mid 20th century had to take on in order for society to function. People lose faith in the social contract that is built around broad-based democratic capitalism. The middle class as an institution begins to shrink, begins to crumble. People sort of give up and fade down into the lower class where they can be taken care of, or in a sort of panic or driven by ambition or whatever, they claw and scrape and fight their way up into the upper middle class and maybe into the upper class, although that, those people have just climbed into a golden hot air balloon and sort of floated away. So, we're seeing these changes, and the response coming out of younger Americans is to seek some kind of escape, whether it's an escape via left-wing means or right-wing means. And that's going to have a profound effect, an ongoing effect on our politics. And it's going to be one where, the dreaded midwit character of someone who says, "Oh, but, I did everything right. I got good grades. I went to the best college I could get into. I read books. No one wants to hear that guy talk. They want that guy to shut up and sort of go away. And the preference is increasingly for something that is less noisy, less explanatory, more driven by instinct, more driven by nonverbal communication, visual communication, all the kinds of stuff that you see when you see memes taking over and those kinds of long explainers and essays becoming less of a cultural force. Novels, who reads novels anymore? I mean, this stuff is everywhere. And I think that this is, I'm definitely not making a call to just burn the books and welcome the idiocracy. But we've got to admit that these changes are massive, and we can't really sweep back the sea. What impact is that going to have on things? Well, there's a growing number of even, sort of intelligent and mild-mannered folks out there who say this is headed for war. It's the only place it can go. If we're not going to be sitting around having parliamentary debates and, discursively challenging each other like gentlemen, then it's probably going to end up with a deeply polarized society going to war. I continue to think that would be a catastrophe. People think, oh no, it's going to be great because my enemies are going to be too weak to survive in the post-apocalyptic America, whereas our guys are going to have all of the bunkers and all of the tactical fittings on our guns. It's not that simple. If anyone is familiar with Yugoslavia and familiar with the way that the guys who prepared best in Yugoslavia for the Civil War actually were the first ones to just get dogpiled by their neighbors because they had the reputation of being the guys who prepared. We don't want that future. And it's going to require a certain amount of civic forgiveness and just biting the bullet and understanding that if we don't get a grip on some of this stuff, then we are going to spiral in a direction that's just going to be catastrophic. And that's without even thinking about, how our adversaries and enemies around the world are going to respond to a real genuine breakdown of civic order in the United States. So, it's a lot to spin out of a couple of memes about how stupid is cool now, but I think the warning signs are there, and to a degree, you have to laugh along. But the larger part of us should be a little bit more serious about it too.
Yeah, no, well said. I mean, just to add a brief note to this, and then we should move on. We ought to parse slightly more minutely, I think, the cat lady gate comments from J.D. Vance. This was when he was on Tucker Carlson long ago, like 4 years, I think, or so ago. He said the problems with the country boil down to being run by childless cat ladies. This was not at a time when he had ambitions, or at least openly stated ambitions, to become the vice president of the United States. Nevertheless, it has haunted him and serves, I think, as the emblem of Vance as weird for those people that want to position him as such. What's really interesting to me about this is if we adopt the posture of charity that James is advocating from however far a distance of ideological difference we have to travel to do that, we can all pretty much see exactly what Vance meant. And even if we don't agree, we can see how the world might look to him that way. I personally think that if you translate Vance's TV punditry speak into real life details, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to the idea that kind of as we destroyed the nuclear family, we ended up ruled over or dominated at work by exactly the people who should have the least power and control. And that this person is at least mimically represented, if not literally equivalent to a childless cat lady. That's not how you would say it if you were running for vice president. You would frame it differently. I understand that. But Vice wasn't running for vice president at the time. He was talking to Tucker Carlson on Fox News. All of that having been said, I think this illuminates something which, look, this particular semantic wavelet seems to be cresting and is going to pass. I don't think we're going to be talking forever about who's weird and who's not weird. The larger issues that we've been discussing on this show now for a while are definitely going to be with us for a long time. And part of it, I think, has to do with this thing that both Alexis de Tocqueville and C.S. Lewis, interestingly, observed about democracies, which is that if not in principle and by necessity, then at least in practice and very regularly, capital D democratic governments tend to produce small d democratic societies that tend toward conformity. And that maybe this is one of the problems that they have a genetic predisposition towards. It's very difficult to seek out unusual modes of life in a democracy in a way that it's not when there's a kind of aristocratic whiff to certain, at least unusual ways of doing things. And this does produce a really weird situation that I think is part and parcel of American history, which is that on the one hand, there still is a lot of cachet to marginal lifestyles, to things that not everybody has thought of, especially if they seem to trend toward what's coming down the pike. If they're bohemian, if they're avant-garde, all of that comes with this aristocratic feeling. It also comes, I think, with like the cultural cachet of cool and all the stuff that the parties are now scrambling over like a football. At the same time, it also comes with this enormous danger of either co-optation. So either your cool weirdness basically just gets assimilated into a marketing ploy and all the juice gets sucked out of it, which has happened, I think, to a lot of fringe subcultures, rock, the LGBTQIA plus movement, all of that. You can see it just like instantly losing its cool as it becomes a movement or a thing in democratic politics. Or you're just going to get pilloried by the mob that killed Socrates, right? You're going to become like a social outcast. And everybody wants kind of to be an individual without suffering the risks or the consequences of individuality in this situation. And that is like something that might just be kind of baked into this equation. So the question is really going to become not what happens to be weird or normal at any given moment, but what do you want to be weird and what do you want to be normal? My feeling is that kind of the canonical virtues and the simple realities that James is suggesting now carry a certain degree of attractiveness ought to be like our North Star or our fixed center. And all this other stuff, good and bad, that is now normalized ought to be sort of on the fringes. I think Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party represent a movement to do the opposite of that. And if they can succeed, then like we will be deeper into the digital funhouse of Hall of Mirrors than I might have hoped.
Oh, I just want to pull on this thread one more time, Spencer, because you sparked something, a thought anyway. Yeah, I mean, you said big D Democrat. That is, I think you meant democratic administrations or democratic.
Yeah, sorry,
politics.
not the party. Usually that means the party, but I just meant like having a structurally democratic policy.
I see. Well, I want to flip it and say, I think there's another aspect to this too, which is that big D Democrat sensibilities, progressive as they are, and with their historicist assumptions that they have, they produce small d democratic tendencies or accelerate them in society, but they also problematically accelerate them in their own party. So say what you want about the early progressives and their policy stances that grew out of this disposition, but they were decidedly aristocratic. And take your flavor of aristocracy. They were, they had this whole theory of race and all the rest. They were very hierarchical. The original idea of leadership that grew out of Woodrow Wilson and others was not was really to and others have mentioned this often. This is not an original insight to me. I've learned from a lot of our Claremont teachers, but their view was, leadership is all about it's about taking the people along with you, but really you have to see into the future and take them with you in a kind of hierarchical way. You see farther than they do. You're actually in a way better than they are. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a great progressive nihilist on the Supreme Court, referenced the thick-fingered masses. You get a flavor of the kind of aristocratic bent of early progressivism. But as that movement has gone on for a century, you do get the sense that it has become more small d democratic in the sense of the ancient political philosophers. That is to say, we're all equal in all things. Everyone's tastes are equal. Everyone's desires are equal. And so it's kind of corrupted the leadership of the Democratic Party too. So I think that's a bit of the source of the schizophrenia that you see from Obama, from Harris, from Biden. They do want to lead because having power is good and shaping policy is good, but they can't but help themselves with kind of be swept along in the current of history as they see it. And so whatever trend they see amongst their masses that vote for them, they kind of, whether it's kneeling in kente cloth or whatever else, even if they have better instincts, they feel like they just have to go along with the latest thing. I don't know what relation that has to our discussion of weird, but it becomes this vicious cycle on the, call it, for lack of a better term, the populist left, that leads it into just this complete inability to discriminate amongst the desires of its constituencies. It's a big part of the internecine war that's going on within the Democratic Party, with the different factions arguing for their pet projects and their pet desires and translating them into policy, whether it be weird anti-Semitic left radicalism or weird sort of round the bend identity politics on sexual identity and all the rest. And look, this small d democratization of American politics has infected the right as well. I think at their best, the more thoughtful members of the left who worry about right-wing populism worry about the same phenomenon as a mirror image to what I just described on the left, which is right-wing politicians riding to power the basest instincts of their majority or plurality voters. So it's just a long way of saying the tendencies of democracies, as Tocqueville described them, as Aristotle and Plato described them, are real. They're destructive. And unless you can somehow preserve some authority, for hierarchy, for good and bad, for excellence, for some standards, it's going to be a tale as old as time. A corruption and degeneration of popular government into something that's ugly, factional, ultimately violent, and miserable.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting and actually directly relevant to the stuff we were talking about. It helps explain why the Republicans too, but I think especially the Democrats, are constantly finding themselves in this situation where they desperately want the allure and excitement of youth culture, of subculture, of new, vibey, interesting art and cultural material. But the minute they touch it, it crumbles in their hand into this withered, desiccated shell of itself. And it instantly becomes cringe. It's like everything they touch turns to cringe, even as they grasp out to the farthest reaches of society to find some new interesting thing. This is what has happened to the aesthetic, for example, of drag, which started out as this weird grunge underground movement, then became a political football, and subsequently therefore was endorsed and maximalized by politically interested Democrats. And now, as we saw at the Olympics, is not only grotesque and a kind of abomination of blasphemous mockery, but also really ugly and cringe and not all that interesting. So I do think like that's probably a feature of what you're describing, Ryan. And it also, as luck would have it, provides a really neat segue into our next topic, because as we're talking about obscure and recherche democratic policies, we must discuss court packing, which has returned like some kind of zombified policy proposal out of the graveyard of FDR's worst impulses. Was sort of a hot topic, as I recall, during the 2020 election. Then, as Biden took office and as his term got rolling, seemed to recede into the background. He sort of deferred it to committee for a while. But suddenly, as he was starting to waver, as his footing was starting to falter, and it looked like he might get kicked out. But before he had made his announcement that he was going to leave, he suggested he was going to make a big move on this topic, restructuring the Supreme Court in some way or another. And it looked kind of like a sop to the progressives. Please don't eat me. I'll keep me in power, and I'll, give you your fondest wish, which is basically the dismantlement of the American system of government. But now that that ship has sailed, he still on Monday gave an address in which he proposed a really radical set of policies that would effectively court pack by other means. These include a binding ethical code, which was clearly aimed at a bunch of things that the Democrats have faulted the latest court for, You have to disclose gifts you receive. You have to recuse yourself from cases when you or your spouse has a conflict of interest, all of that. But also overturning the qualified presidential immunity that was recently affirmed by the Supreme Court via constitutional amendment. And this is the big one, term limits for justices. So you have an 18-year term as a Supreme Court justice. The terms would be staggered. And so effectively, this would mean that like every president gets a prize. You get to nominate your people. And this is, I guess, supposed to keep the court balanced. Of course, what it would really do is turn the court into an object of political tug of war. Kamala has endorsed it. Joe Biden did not when he was a younger man. Before he became president, he said in no uncertain terms that, quote, FDR's plan was a terrible, terrible mistake to make. And it put in question for an entire decade the independence of the most significant body, including the Congress, in my view, the most significant body in this country, the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So, Brian, Claremont spokesperson, do we agree with young Joe Biden or old Joe Biden about court packing? And what will it do for Kamala's prospect?
Well, I don't know. I think this is kind of a desperate play by an outgoing president who won't run again to leave his mark somehow, and it vibes with the times and the sentiment on the left, which is it's for those who are familiar with the court's history as a quote unquote conservative or liberal court. It's another sign of this progressive tendency that I've been talking about, which is to say, whatever we, the Democratic Party, have decided is good and true cannot be retrenched upon or debated upon at all now. So we've really only had a conservative, quote unquote, conservative court in the sense of having a 6-member conservative court. And that should even be caveated because they do not vote in lockstep on high profile, high temperature cases nearly as much as the Democrats do on the court. That's only been around since 2017. So you've had, 7 years of it, 6.5 years of it, and it's already a fundamentally threatening force to democracy, by which they mean our democracy, a theme we've talked about a lot. And so, Leonard Leo had I don't know if it was a tweet or a statement turned into a tweet or what, and he had it pretty well pegged. I mean, one of the major players over the last 40 years in doing the institution building and civic institution building and networking and all the rest required to bring about this transformation of the court, which had been pretty liberal, especially on issues of individual rights, as far as the Democrats consider them, which is a different notion of rights than the rights of the right or the Republicans consider them, and especially on issues like criminal justice reform and all else. After 50 years, longer, of most broadly considered ascent from one plateau of new realm of justice to another, they get a little bit of retrenchment. And within that retrenchment, some robust debates, even amongst the conservatives, and some dissenting views. And it's suddenly, it's like it's 1932 all over again, and we have to fix the court and all the rest. So Leo's point was, let's just peg this for what it is. It's partisanship masquerading as righteous indignation over policy differences, basically. So it's hard to take the Democrats that seriously on this. And as you said, Joe Biden is a perfect example for why we shouldn't take it seriously, because he was literally on the other side of this issue pretty recently as a institutional defender of the court. So it's just a campaign sop. They hope to make some hay out of it. In a way, maybe on the flip side of Trump's success in 2016 in shoring up some of the anxiety on his right about his candidacy by saying, well, look, come on, guys, I'm a constitutionalist. I'm an originalist. Here's my list of judges that I want to appoint. It's basically the FedSoc judges, so you don't have to worry. I think it's the left's version of that, which is everything's at stake because the Supreme Court is so important. And I also would just conclude the mini rant by saying it would be institutionally disastrous if you gave each president 2 appointments per term. I don't. It's hard to tell exactly how the scheme would work with the mix of term limits imposed for justices now going forward. Would it be retroactive? It's hard to say. Uh, how many members of the court would this bloat the court to in the meantime? And finally, to close on the old point of hierarchy and excellence and independence, it would completely destroy that on the court. So, to the extent that what I offered in the last segment was a worry, and you too, Spencer, a worry about the worst tendencies of small d democracy, that is, all tastes and desires are equal, and thus it's pure majoritarianism, whatever the people think or can be convinced of at any given moment, leading to very volatile politics. The one bulwark against that, or maybe the most robust one in being anti-democratic, was the court with its lifetime appointments and all the rest. So it's just another example of a short or near-term short-sightedness on the left, with no real regard for the institutional or regime effects that what they're proposing might have. And I've been listening, as everyone does. We all have our lineup of podcasts, and from the more Claremont sympathetic folks at Powerline all the way over to the commentary podcast, the universal sentiment on this we all share, which is, don't think the Democrats really realize what kind of fire they're playing with. If you think the Supreme Court is bad now, wait till you just make it pretty much another political branch without even the veneer of doing something that's higher, at its best, higher and more principled. It cannot be good, especially if you put it in a larger context of our current politics, which is deeply ideologically divided. We're all grasping at straws, any straw we can find, to somehow preserve institutional guardrails, some norms, some notion of objective guidance rather than just pure majoritarian will. And so on 5 or 6 levels at least, this is just a terrible, terrible idea.
I have 2 theories. Theory 1 is the more benign of the 2, and it is, well, let's just throw something out there that's never going to happen, but it'll show that there's still some life in this administration left, and we can spin up a new meme and find a new way to sort of rile up the base, and probably will never happen. Certainly not going to happen in this lame duck, if we still use that term, Biden administration. So what the hell? We can wheel him out and he can read the words, and that'll at least get us 1 week closer to the end of this whole mess. That's theory 1. Theory 2 is, checking in on the 3 branches of government. We have a legislature, a legislative branch, which has been dramatically weakened over the course of the past several decades. So much of its authority has been delegated and outsourced to the administrative state and or the deep state, if you prefer to use that term, or the blob, or the Borg, or its name is Legion. Checking in on the executive, the presidency. The office of the president has also been dramatically weakened over the course of several decades. The intelligence community, the executive agencies, we saw with Trump, it's just very difficult for a guy to even just fire civil servants in his own branch. So that's 2 out of 3 branches that have been dramatically weakened, at least from the standpoint of the Constitution and voters. Okay, and this brings us to the judiciary. Wow, who would it benefit to weaken this 3rd branch of the government in favor of the shadow government? Once again, because gosh, if the presidency and Congress and the Supreme Court are all weakened, then that can only possibly benefit the shadow branch of government, where you can't vote people in, you can't vote them out, you don't know who they are, they could be in there for their entire lives or maybe even longer. And so when you think about this in terms of who benefits, I think it clearly benefits those individuals and groups in Washington and elsewhere in the world who see the United States Constitution as probably at this point, weakened, but still the last serious impediment to really full-blown globalization as a form of governance. I don't know which of those two theories is the more plausible. I know which one keeps me up at night, and it's not theory.
I'm going to go with theory 2A or 2B, I guess, which is that this is a trial balloon. I don't suspect court packing this time around is really going to fly. I even think Kamala might have to distance herself from it. We'll see kind of what happens at the convention and which way she tacks vis-a-vis the extreme left and all the really radical elements of her party. But I think much as Joe Biden had to kind of signal his disinterest in some of the more outlandish policy proposals of the left, I think Kamala is probably going to have to do the same if she can. She's yoked to a much worse record on that even than Biden was. But I do think that if you start it here with this lame duck gesture, then you can get the idea in more fully into the bloodstream than it already was, which was somewhat because it was up for grabs in 2020. And then you just gradually walk it forward every chance you get, which is sort of how these left-wing movements tend to work. That sort of looks like what's going on here. And I would add to this kind of what Ryan was saying, about the fact that this is something that the Democrats have only decided is a problem within the last 5 minutes or so when the court stopped going their way. So it might be that they're interrupted in their long game by a sudden realization, if the court does move left again, that actually they really love the independent judiciary now. And WTF, like the Supreme Court suddenly turned great again, because this really only became an issue when Trump struck it big, had a combination of good luck and sound judgment in appointing his 3 nominees and then attaining a court that has an actual interpretative strategy, which by and large tends to favor like doing what the Constitution says. All of a sudden, it turns out, like in the last 5 minutes, we've discovered all sorts of ethical problems with the court and its structure and with like the constitutional article that outlines it. So like, quick guys, let's pack it. I think probably down, because the court is the branch of government that operates in the longest term, plays the longest game. If the form of government that we currently have generally holds, the court will continue to be an enemy of the left by and large on the whole. And for that reason, you're probably going to see this court packing proposal not succeed this time, but gradually creep its way further and further into the center of the discourse, which is why it's a good idea to be emphatic against it now. With that, we have reached that time once again where we need to remind you to read the damn site. We do not just mouth off on podcasts. We also publish writing, our own and that of other people. The website is called AmericanMind.org. You can find new pieces up there every day, and we like to pick one each per episode to commend to you. I will go first and recommend A National Revival? ? At CRB, we have a joke that you only get one question mark in the title per issue. Online, we do not have these sorts of restrictions, so we can go wild with our use of punctuation. Joe Alto, full disclosure, is a friend of mine, but he has written, I think, a really smart assessment of the Donald Trump assassination attempt, which I have not quite seen described in exactly this way. And it's based on an analogy between the public's encounter with the American spirit and the Christians' encounter with the Holy Spirit. Joe's suggestion is that even as a Catholic, and certainly as a Protestant, you can't just know about the faith. You have to, at some point, have a dramatic religious encounter with the emotional vibes, if I can put it that way, of the joy of God. And similarly, it's well known that America has a kind of civic religion, that its particular brand of patriotism requires a real personal, emotional attachment to all the symbols of the country. And Joe proposes that seeing Donald Trump get back up after that near miss, pump his fist in the air with blood streaming down his face and chant "fight, fight, fight," seeing that captured with the American flag behind it might be many people's first real encounter with a vigorous, confident, defiant American spirit of the kind that used to be widespread but has been receding from the land of late, both for structural reasons and also by the design of people like Nicole Hannah-Jones who want to siphon it out of the hearts of the public. This, I would suggest, might be why you are seeing so many people crop that American flag out of the Donald Trump images. And I think Joe hits on something quite precise about the nature of not necessarily the policy proposals, but the emotional attitudes that are going to be at stake in this election. A national rival ? By Joe Alto. Ryan, what do you got?
Well, I've got a piece that's both informative for a recent campaign event from the Harris campaign, but also ties in a lot of the themes that we've been hitting here. And that is our own Seth Behrens, who can't be with us today. All the White Dudes published yesterday about the Harris campaign desperately trying to recreate or create the appearance of excitement. The opening paragraph says it all, or gives you the tease in for those of you that missed this phenomenon. The Kamala Harris presidential campaign is in full swing, and in keeping with the Democrats' safe space neo-segregationist principles, it organized a series of mass Zoom calls oriented to different demographic groups. Inspired by a supposedly organic gathering of 90,000 Black women on Zoom, other, quote, identity groups wanted in, with conclaves planned for Black queer men, South Asian women, Latinas, Native women, and white men. Not wishing to intrude on anyone's curated spaces, I logged on to White Dudes for Harris on Monday night to see what the Harris campaign was asking of me and 100 million other white American men. Read Seth's recounting of it. It will catch you up on this weird little pocket of campaign politics, which has gone it's been all over social media, or at least was for a day, with clips of it. You can find a supercut or two of it from critics from the right. It's an event it's a punchy little column from Seth, so it'll catch you up on what actually happened. But it's a beautiful illustration. That is, Seth's writing is a beautiful illustration. Any illustration of such a phenomenon can't help but be kind of ugly. But it captures a major theme of the Kamala Harris campaign, which is that her race is centered to it. It expands out to the modern obsession on the left with identity groups, and it mocks the very mockable aspects of it. It's both informative and situates it in our larger political cultural moment, and it does it all in about 900 words. So go check out Seth Behrens' All the White Dudes.
Absolutely. Great piece, and excellent to mention, Ryan, because it fills in the other segment we were going to do but ran out of time for, which is White Dudes for Kamala.
Right.
And Trump's comments thereon. Okay, James, what do you got?
I will have to save my White Russians for Kamala Jeff Bridges joke for another occasion, sadly. I have Europe Clamps Down by Michael O'Shea. Michael is a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute out there in Hungary. He's got an eye on Europe, and so should you. It's bad. It's bad news. Spoiler alert. This is a piece about Europe's crackdown on media, including X.com, among other things. And Michael ends with the observance that in the increasingly likely event of a second Trump administration, the European Union will have cultivated hostile relationships with Washington, Beijing, and Moscow alike. Doesn't seem like a very good grand strategy, if you ask me. Real trouble from the top at Europe. Just when you think that the U.S. is the most dysfunctional political game in town, Europe comes along. So check out the piece and keep it in the back of your mind as events unfold here. Fortunately, it's, the good news is it's not all about the U.S. presidential election. The bad news is it's not all about the U.S. presidential election.
That's a tagline for this show this year, I think. All right. That's it, all the time we have today. Thanks, Ryan and James. Lots of fun, as always, to be with you. If you like this show and you like what we do here at TAM, there's lots of other opportunities to connect with us and get to know the work of the Claremont Institute. You can visit our sister publication, Claremont Review of Books, at ClaremontReviewofBooks.com. You can check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And you can donate to support our work, which we would heartily appreciate in any amount, large or small, at claremont.org/donate. That's how we keep the lights on. And we like to not to proceed in the dark, as we hope you do too. That's why you listen to this podcast. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks very much to all of you for listening. We will talk to you next week.